Welcome to the Long 60s, Washington paintings in the Watkins and Corcoran Legacy Collections, 1957 to 1982. The American University Museum recently acquired 9,000 works from the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which closed its doors in 2014. Together with our Watkins collection, Washington regional artists are very well represented. While curating this show on the history of Washington paintings drawn from our collections, I saw how my memories of the past were affecting my choices of artwork. The most influential time for me and other baby boomers has been called the Long 60s by both National Gallery of Art curator James Meyer and 60s anti-war and civil rights activist Tom Hayden. I have identified my own Long 60s as the years from 1957 to 1982. This exhibition presents my very personal take on the art I found most revealing of the culture that produced it, within a 50-mile radius of Washington, D.C. I was going to limit this exhibition to paintings drawn from our collections, but soon it became clear this limitation was creating absences in the exhibition. I could see Washington art history would be terribly skewed when limited to work purchased by collectors and then accessioned by museums. It perpetuated the baked-in prejudices of Washington's art historical canon. When I finally opened up the Long 60s to works outside of our collections, I was able to undo a few of those prejudices. The Long 60s began for me in Appleton, Wisconsin in 1957. I was in third grade, watching the funeral of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy is seen here with his chief counsel and fixer, Roy Cohn. I heard the term McCarthyism repeated by my parents many times. They were talking about the Red Scare, McCarthy's practice of making unfounded accusations against federal employees, artists, and others they suspected of being communist sympathizers. He further fanned our fears of nuclear war. I remember the duck and cover drills every morning in my elementary school, right after the Pledge of Allegiance. In 1957, abstract expressionism was the dominant art movement in the US. Huge canvases, strong gestures, and emotional content. We can see all these elements here in Kenneth Nolan's Lavender Blue. We now know abstract expressionism, as well as jazz, was employed as a Cold War weapon by the CIA in its fight against communism. Our government used our music and art to demonstrate to the world how free we were, how open we were to self-expression. Never mind that abstract expressionists were mostly leftists being hounded by McCarthy, or that our black jazz ambassadors remained second-class citizens when they returned home. Art historians tell us of Helen Frankenthaler's experiments in her studio and her discovery that thinned oil paint would soak into and stain unprimed canvas. There was no need anymore for a brush manipulated by the artist's hand. Thinned paint flowed where directed by gravity. Nolan visited Frankenthaler's studio, saw her painting Mountains and Sea, and the rest is history, as they say. Advanced painting became stain painting, making possible the color field painting and the rise of the Washington Color School. Acclaimed by some as the climax of modernism in the first half of the 20th century, others saw it as modernism's dead end, disconnected as it was from the social-political disorder of the times. Greenberg's brand of formalism imposed very strict limitations on artists. Only art's purely visible aspects were important. Intentions had no place, nor did gestures of the artist's hand, drawing, subject matter, pictorial allusion, narrative content of any kind, or any relationship at all to the visible world, let alone its social and political context. Howard Mehring was a student of Nolan's at Catholic University. He too made a pilgrimage to meet Helen Frankenthaler with fellow student Tom Downing. The size and overall composition of Mehring's playground shows its depth to abstract expressionism, but the relatively measured coolness of his application showed he was moving towards what would become the Washington Color School. At the same time, Nolan and Mehring were abandoning personal gestural expressions for cooler, more remote abstractions. Robert Franklin Gates and other Washington artists were moving in the opposite direction, turning back towards figuration, but keeping its vigorous expressionist brushwork. They were part of a larger resistance, which included artists like Richard Diebenkorn, associated with the Bay Area Figurative School coming out of San Francisco at that time. Both Gates and Diebenkorn were greatly influenced by the Phillips Collection, the country's first museum for modern art. Gates was a student at the Phillips Gallery Art School and then taught and exhibited there until the U.S. entered World War II. Diebenkorn was a Marine stationed at Quantico and spent much of his free time during the war in the Phillips looking at Bonnard and Matisse. Diebenkorn and Gates' figurative work was collected in depth by Duncan Phillips, and it remained a significant influence on American University's art department. Another determining influence was Philip Guston, whose work had undergone a similar transition from figuration to abstract expressionism and back again, though to a very personal and idiosyncratic figurative style. The decidedly politicized content of his work, featuring cartoonishly devastating portraits of Richard Nixon and Ku Klux Klan members, remains controversial today. Helene Mackenzie Hertzsprung was one of Gates' students. She would become an American University professor herself. Hertzsprung was immediately drawn to abstract expressionism and never did abandon strong gesture and emotional content, resisting the pull of the Washington Color School. Gates, Hertzsprung, and American University's art department were largely responsible for the continued relevance of figurative and expressionist painting in Washington for 3 decades. They kept it alive, though it was clear figurative and expressionist painting was at cross purposes with what mainstream paintings by mostly white male artists looked like in the 60s and into the 70s. It became clear in the late 60s that all attempts to bring peaceful change would fail. Many in my generation dropped out rather than take their politics to its logical conclusion, the streets. The counterculture had arrived with its free love, medications, and great music. As a revolution, it produced mixed results. We now know LSD was developed by the CIA and used in mind control experiments between 1953 and 1964. Hayden argues that the drug-fueled counterculture, and I quote, overtook, competed with, and weakened the idea of radical political reform. His argument offers an explanation as to why there is so little socially or politically engaged painting by white male artists in the 60s and early 70s in the Washington region, and so little political reform. Bickley Green was part of a younger generation of painters influenced by Frankenthaler, producing convincing work early on in her career that followed the path being worn by the Color School. But after successfully establishing herself with stained paintings like this one, Bickley Green's art became associated with the pattern and decoration movement led by Miriam Shapiro and Joyce Kozloff, coinciding with her involvement in the emerging women's movement. This more politicized work was not being collected by museums. Women artists like Bickley Green found their voices in the feminist movement, while white male artists remained disconnected from what was happening around them. Gene Davis made this painting in 1966. It's the perfect expression of Washington Color School painting. The commercial and critical success of the Color School may have had more to do with its separation from politics than its strictly decorative qualities. Here was the perfect corporate art, born of an art movement whose content did not have to be explained because it had none. It avoided controversy by being only about itself and could be shown without risk of embarrassment or, more importantly, risk of defunding the venue that gave it space. To really understand the great divide that existed in 60s Washington art between the white male mainstream and women and artists of color, one only need compare 2 paintings made in 1969. Consider Grid Number 6 by Tom Downing. What started as a liberating movement for artists under the sway of the Washington Color School ended in an aesthetic lockdown, exemplified by this work by Downing. In contrast to Downing's work, Joe Shannon explodes out of the times in which it was made. Born in Lares, Puerto Rico, Shannon's work has no hesitation about challenging Washington's dominant sensibilities. It addressed social, political, and professional ills. In a city so dedicated to the buttoned-up and uncontroversial, it is not surprising Shannon's paintings were not a big influence on most Washington painters. What figurative art there was became sanitized, toned down in the hands of the white mainstream artists. But a few, notably women and artists of color, had already committed to using their art as instruments of change. They were systematically excluded from the commercial gallery museum system. We'll talk about their art in part 2, Pushback Against the Color School.